Hello and welcome to another TLDR UK video. Today, May 6th, is election day in the UK, as we keep reminding you, which means that Brits will be heading to the polls to select new parliaments in Scotland and Wales, new police and crime commissioners, new mayors, and as we'll be discussing today, new local councils too. We've discussed all of these others before, they're linked in the description, but considering how important local councils are, we thought we should give you a brief history of them, why they matter so much, and which parties are most likely to come out winning at the end of tonight. Before we dive into the local council elections, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell. We're tantalisingly close to 500,000 subscribers on the channel, so get yourself more informed and get us to 500,000. Thanks so much for your support. Let's start by explaining exactly what local council elections are. Well, as the name implies, they're elections for your local government. While the news typically covers elections, scandals, and policies from national politics, local politics doesn't generally get the same attention. But this isn't to say that nothing important happens in local government, nor does it mean that what happens isn't important. Local governments are generally responsible for providing services to people and businesses in small defined areas. For example, it simply wouldn't be practical for the national government to organise bin rotas for the whole country, nor would it make sense for national governments to fix old roads or install new ones. Instead, local councils take on this responsibility. Local councils provide services such as waste collection, housing and planning, social care, licensing, business support, registrar services, and pest control. As these services affect and are paid for by locals as part of their council tax, elections need to take place to ensure that locals are represented. These elected heads of the council are known as councillors, and their job is to work with the local community to set the council's priorities. In the UK, we don't just have one type of council though, we have two. Some councils have opted for a two-tiered structure, whereas others have opted for a single-tier structure. The two-tiered structure is exactly what it sounds like. There are two councils, each of which have their own responsibilities. For the two-tiered structure, the larger council would be the county council, and the smaller council would be the district council. County councils are responsible for education, highways, transport planning, passenger transport, social care, libraries, waste disposal and strategic planning, while district councils are responsible for housing, leisure and recreation, environmental health, waste collection, planning applications and local taxation collections. Single-tier councils, however, come in a few forms. In London, each borough has its own council, which splits responsibility between itself and the Greater London Assembly. In some cities, there are metropolitan areas, which largely just take on all of the responsibilities of both tiers in the two-tier council system. The City of London is always an exception to rules like this, as it has its own type of council, which has some very different responsibilities due to the city's unique structure. It's always easier though if you try not to overanalyze the City of London and just let it be, because otherwise you can confuse yourself into oblivion. So anyway, there are these two different types of council, but how are they elected and how do they work? Well, each council breaks down into electoral areas. These are either called wards or divisions, depending on the kind of council. Each of these electoral areas will typically have between 1 and 3 councillors representing them. Councils themselves decide how frequently their local elections occur, but don't worry, there is some standardisation here, which makes sure that the system shouldn't benefit one council over another. When it comes to the type of election, councils can either have one whole council election every 4 years, they can have half of their councillors elected every 2 years, or they can have a third of their councillors elected every year, with no elections happening on the 4th year. Today, councils that are scheduled to will be holding their elections, as well as those who missed elections last year due to the coronavirus. Around 28 million people in the UK are eligible to vote in these local council elections, and there are more than 4,650 positions up for grabs. These positions are available in 143 councils that are hosting elections this year. Each voter in the council election gets 1 vote per available seat in their electoral area. So if in your ward, for example, there are 3 councillors, then you'll be entitled to 3 votes. Throughout England, Scotland and Wales, the Conservatives currently have 6,993 councillors, Labour have 5,995, the Liberal Democrats 2,447, the Green Party 365, the SNP 400, and Plaid Cymru 196. As each council has a number of elected councillors, it's possible to determine how many councils are led by each party. The Conservatives lead 173 councils, Labour lead 131, the Liberal Democrats run 37 councils, the SNP have 14, Plaid 4, and the Green Party just 1. So that's the current composition of the councils, but what's actually likely to happen in the election today? Well, as absolutely no one should find surprising, the biggest issue in this election is going to be the coronavirus. After all, as we stated earlier, councils are responsible for tax, leisure services, public transport, business support, and licensing, all of which have been heavily affected by the pandemic. So exactly how will voters look at what's happened so far? Will they look favourably upon the governing Conservative Party and give them more council seats, demonstrating their appreciation for things like furlough and the successes of the vaccine rollout? Or will they punish them for the multiple lockdowns we've had to endure and the in excess of 100,000 deaths as a result of COVID? Well, so far, polling seems to demonstrate that voters are leaning towards the former interpretation. Robert Hayward, a polling expert, claims that a vaccine bounce will likely occur, contributing to the Conservatives' vote share. The argument goes that as the over 55s are the most likely age group to vote, and they're the ones who are most likely to have received a coronavirus jab, they'll look upon the Conservatives favourably and will actually turn out to vote for them. This is currently the suggestion of what could happen, but of course this could change, or it could just be wrong. In fact, you can have an impact on this yourself if you're one of the 28 million people in the UK who are eligible to vote today. That is, of course, if you decide to use your vote. Unfortunately, turnout is usually only about a third in local elections, meaning that 2/3 of people who are eligible to vote choose not to do so. This could be for wide-ranging reasons, from not understanding what local elections do to simply not caring. And to be fair, historically it seems that when people do vote, they use it as a protest against the incumbent government. For example, when Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, Labour held only 28.5% of council seats. By 1983, through local elections, this had jumped to 34%, and by the time she left office in 1990, Labour held 35.7% of council seats. However, just because Thatcher left office, this doesn't mean that the Conservative Party were no longer in power, because John Major took over as the new Prime Minister. As a result, Labour's council seats continued to climb, and by New Labour's landslide victory in 1997, Labour held 46.7% of local council seats. That means that throughout the Conservatives' 18 years in power, Labour increased its total number of council seats from only 28.5% to 46.7%. The interesting question to ask now, though, is did Labour lose council seats as Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997? If they did, that would indicate that local elections weren't just a protest movement against the Conservatives, but that they were a protest against whichever government was in charge. Well, the Conservatives only had 19.6% of local council seats in 1997, and by the time Blair left office in 2007, the Conservatives had increased that number to 42%, double what they had in 97. And in the same time, Labour had gone from 46.7% to 24.3%. While this is only an indication, and far from a comprehensive analysis of local election history, it does show that local elections are often seen by the electorate as a way of sticking it to the government. Weirdly though, since 2015, this trend does seem to be faltering. Labour had more councillors in 2015 than any year since, so perhaps the trend is no longer the case. Ultimately, it's completely up to the voter how they choose to vote in the local election. And if voters want to use it to signal their dissatisfaction with the incumbent government, well, that's up to them. Conversely, if you want to use your vote to signal that you like the government, then of course you can do that too. Ultimately, it's up to you to analyse the candidates to see who'll be a best fit for your local area. Or you can just vote for the party you like most. That's your right too. Regardless, make sure that you vote in the local elections today if you're eligible, as well as voting for all of the other things happening in your area. And yes, it is today, so make sure you get to the polling station and make your voice heard. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that's in the description.